Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us throughout the day. We're excited to bring you our last session. As the country grapples with the sense of urgency to redefine public safety and community justice, practitioners may have a platform to chart a way forward. This session will take Dallas County as a case study for centering community voice and equity in a transformational change model. We're excited to have Dr. Larry Terry, Executive Director of the Weldon Cooper School of Public Health, and Elizabeth Henneke, the Executive Director of Lone Star Justice Alliance, share a presentation as our final session for the day. After their presentation concludes, we'll open up to a moderated Q&A from the chat function. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Terry now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure it's been a long day, so thank you for sticking around for this session. It's one that I'm really proud to be a part of. As Medina mentioned, my name is Larry Terry. I'm the Executive Director of the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia. And I got here 2 years ago by way of Dallas, Texas. And I'm, of course, a proud Cowboys fan still. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. But I think Dallas, in many ways, for me, has really, made a mark, certainly on me personally, definitely in my career and my interactions with, the Center for Court Innovation and a lot of what we'll discuss today with respect to the Second Chance Community Improvement Program court in Dallas was a big part of that. And so it's something that I'm really proud to discuss with you all. And so I'm going to go ahead and get this this presentation started. Let me see if I can do this without messing it up. Let's share that. Okay, let me do this. Okay. All right. So I'm assuming everybody can see that. Elizabeth, you give me the thumbs up there. We're good. Yeah. Okay. Again, this is about building legitimacy, community justice, and transformational change. And I think that, the SKIP program, as it's called, really embodies that. And I want to begin actually by taking a moment to recognize a number of people who led to SKIP's founding and have really given their livelihood and their careers to making sure that something like this is able to get off the ground. Of course, I want to begin with Judge Rick Magnus and Judge Stephanie Huff, who have put in a lot of work to get this up and running and have really provided a solid foundation for that. Ulysses Waters, of course, who I'm sure is on this session somewhere, even though I can't see her, and who is currently the Deputy Director of LSJA, of course. I want to also recognize Paul Blocker, Dallas County Public Defender's Office, who does a great job in his role. Stephanie Gonzalez, who was formerly a part of the SKIP team and of the Dallas County DA's office. Sergeant Hillengard from the Dallas Police Department. Dr. Julie Sadiq from the University of North Texas at Dallas, who assisted and did a lot of and most of the legwork on the community needs assessment that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then finally, my partner in crime, Melita Strong, who is the case manager and does great work out of City Square. So I just want to lay that as a initial thank you to them, because I certainly wouldn't be here in this position to be able to discuss this today. So I just want to provide a little bit of foundational context with respect to SKIP, because even when we were preparing for this this session, a lot of our initial internal discussions were about how do we discuss SKIP in this under this theme of transformative justice, under this theme of social inequities and the need for greater social justice, certainly within the Dallas context, and that matters. But again, every community, every city is going to have a different both historical sort of foundation, but its context is going to be different, and it matters. And I think it's important for us in many ways to have that initial discussion about what is the Dallas context and how sort of SKIP came about in that way. SCIP was founded in 2016, of course, as I mentioned, Judge Rick Magnus, in working with ULIS and the Center for Court Innovation in founding the first felony community court in the county. And I had met ULIS following in 2016, late 2016, following the killing of 5 police officers in downtown Dallas. And she and I had met to discuss sort of what are some of the things that we as a community could do in the aftermath of that. And in that process of sort of speaking with her, she mentioned SCIP to me. And, you know, as part of what they were doing with the Center for Court Innovation, you know, identified that they needed some data work. At the time, I was at the University of North Texas at Dallas and had just founded an institute that was aimed at trying to provide insight and data for things just like this, particularly in Southern Dallas. And so that's where we first had our initial conversations. And I bring this up because shortly after my initial meeting with ULIS, I met Judge Magnus. And I sat down with him just to discuss the nature of SCIP and why he founded it. And I was sort of struck by what he said to me in that moment. He said, we started SCIP because I, as a judge, was tired of putting Black and brown faces disproportionately in incarceration. And it's something that mattered to him. It's something that he had seen for years and years over the course of his career. And that moved him enough to try to do something about it in a really holistic and genuine way. And I think that really is at the heart of SCIP. So, and part of what he was, I think, getting at is that this disproportionate nature of minorities in Dallas in particular, being incarcerated in many instances for nonviolent offenses, going to jail for long periods of time was something that mattered to him. And so really the goal of was to, again, as the name implies, to offer a second chance for those who had been arrested and put in the system for crime or another, but to also give them this opportunity to move on from that and to grow from that experience. And so that was sort of the first part of the foundation, but it was also with the intent of how do we change people's perception of what the criminal justice system is for? Can it be something more than just a punitive institution? Can it actually be a community catalyst and a driver of change and an uplifter in many ways? And so it was about changing values, attitudes, and beliefs in many ways to do that. And so we can see this system not simply to punish. And so initially we focused on, and I believe it still is the same today in many ways, is the 75210, 75215, and 75223 zip codes. And I've got a sort of a visualization here on the slide, and I know it's not all that easy to see, but I think once I explain a little bit, it might make a little bit more sense within the Dallas context. What you're seeing is a visualization and a screenshot from something that the Weldon Cooper Center has on our data side called the racial dot map. And it was produced by our demographics research group back in 2011. I provide the web address at the end of this if you haven't seen it already. But the racial dot map uses census data to pinpoint where every person who participated in the census in 2010, where they live. And it color coded them based on race and ethnicity. So if you look here, what we see is a sort of a snapshot of roughly the downtown Dallas area, and just south of that, which is where the 3 zip codes that I just mentioned are located. In the sort of green dot area, that is where African Americans, as listed in the census, reside and are prominently in the 3 zip codes that we've identified. The brown or yellow dots represent Hispanics, and of course the blue in this instance represents where people who identified as white live in Dallas. And so just with this visualization, you're able to see the way that Dallas is segregated. It's sort of divided by Highway 30 that runs through the middle of it, and we, in south of 30, it's primarily Black residents, and north of that, it seems to shift a little bit, but this visualization in many ways also is a reflection of the historical and institutional sort of measures that have been in place that have made sort of Dallas what it is today. And so this area is where the initial catchment as it's called, was placed, and an area that we wanted to focus on because of the high incidence of crime, high incidence of unemployment, and other sort of place-based disparities that we came to see over time. So initially, SCIP wanted to focus on nonviolent offenders in the ages of 18 to 30, or 18 to 25, excuse me. But in sort of poring over the data, what we found that there were similar incidences and intensity of crime around the 28 to 30 age area, and also levels of sort of development within that group socially. So the age group was expanded to go from 18 to 30. But again, as you can see, sort of in philosophy, was how do we work with those who are emerging adults? So I just want to explain initially the programmatic structure. And as I note here, I feel like it was a purpose-driven ecosystem, and one that fascinated me when I first came to be a part of SCIP. I'm not a lawyer by training, but I think I have some sort of orientation around how the legal system works to an extent. And if you look at this visualization, what we do see are maybe stakeholders or parties that, when in the system, may be initially perceived as adversarial. But in this instance, because it was behind this purpose of how do we use this program to uplift the community, it was really centered on how do we work together. And so you'll see here the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, of course, the Dallas County Public Defender were parts of that. The Dallas City Attorney's Office, of course, where Ulysses worked and helped to bring into the fold. But then you get into these other pieces that I think really made it a nice and sort of organic approach to the way that we looked at the participants and how we worked with them. City Square, which is a very sort of well-known nonprofit in Dallas that does all kinds of great work in terms of addressing homelessness and other sort of community issues, was managed by, did our case management. And again, Ms. Melita Strong still works in that capacity today, and I think is almost, as I see it, sort of the backbone in terms of when participants come in terms of the care and the assessment that they get with her. Dallas Police Department also played a major role in getting to know the participants, and this is in large part, I think, because of as we found through our data, and again, it's not hard to understand, high levels of distrust between police and the community. So how do we sort of open up some of those lines and those dialogue that can allow for some level of transformation? The 283rd District Court, where Judge Magnus, of course, presided, and then myself later as the research and educational partner at UNT Dallas. So that was the initial programmatic structure. And again, one that I thought as a sort of organic construction worked really well. One thing we really talked a great deal about in the first years of SCIP was if we want to have SCIP in this community court to be viewed as more than just criminal justice as a punitive instrument, how can we create a SCIP experience that is really transformational? And so as I sort of titled the slide here, we say transformational over transactional. And I feel like we did and we're really intentional about saying, how can, from the moment we receive a participant in the program, how can we ensure that this experience is certainly have some level of rigor to address sort of the criminal justice aspects to this, but also uplifting to try to get them on the right track. And so the initial form of SCIP was a 3-phase, 9 to 18-month program with bi-weekly court appearances, but with weekly programmatic responsibilities. And it had the 3 phases that each participant had to go through in order to graduate, as it were. The first phase at the time was stabilization, which was basically where participants would come in after they were selected for SCIP, and then an assessment of all of their sort of needs and sort of where they are as a person were done in that space. So it would be looking at anything from, do they need substance abuse treatment, health and wellness checkups, just getting them to the doctor. In these 3 zip codes, I think, as you can imagine, there are lots of sort of healthcare issues, and again, place-based health disparities. So even just sending them to the doctor, the dentist was a big thing at the time. And even in that exchange or that time in the experience, we figured out that their communities and the things that they were enduring were having physical and physiological impacts on their well-being, whether that was high blood pressure for individuals who were 20, 21 years old, diabetes, and all other kinds of things that come from, again, the nature of the environment that they're in. And so getting an understanding of how this may impact some of the decisions that have been made over time and maybe led them to this place that they were. So stabilization was the first phase. The second phase was motivation. So after they moved out of the stabilization, it was now looking at them based on the assessment, where they are with respect to their education. Many participants, at least during my time, had dropped out of middle school, dropped out of high school, didn't have a GED. And so of course, those are major hurdles if you're trying to obtain gainful employment. So motivation was about work readiness training. Can we get them in GED courses so they can get that credential? And also other things about getting them to understand that there is life beyond skip, and that we want to be able to have this phase of motivation as a time where we set almost a vision and a template for what the future can hold for them. And so part of that was where my role, I feel, really was accentuated in that we brought them to the UNT Dallas campus just to see a college campus. Many of them had not stepped foot on a college campus. We also did some work in doing some values and needs and sort of interest assessments with them, just to get a good understanding of what direction and what dreams do they have, what interests do they have potentially in terms of engaging with a certain profession. Can we set them up with mentors and the like, and really try and get them motivated again to get for a life beyond skip. And then the final phase was, of course, actualization. We all seek actualization and want to have that fulfilled life. And so really actualization was, how do we put them on a path for independence? Do they have a stable place to live? Are they working now? And at that point, some of their court-based restrictions were not as frequent. So they may come to court at that point now once a month and just check in to make sure that they're doing okay. But it was now that we've seen this level of progress with the participants, how do we get them to graduation and get onto that next phase of their life? But through this process, I feel like we've worked as partners across the community and other assets in order to address the holistic needs of the individual. And I think that that's one thing that really struck me in this process is we recognize that they are in this situation. They may have committed a crime, but how do we look at them as human beings and do what we can to address the human element of what they're going through? And so I think that this team, as I mentioned sort of in that previous slide, the makeup of that team allowed for that kind of humanization that I think we all need to happen. So we in 2017, is again, not only as part of our work with the Center for Court Innovation and some of the things that they would have liked to see out of SCIP, but also just to get a better understanding of how we can serve our participants. And again, as I mentioned earlier, by extension, the community more effective. We conducted a community needs assessment for a good duration of the 2017 calendar year. And that entailed a number of things, again, across these 3 zip codes, but all with the intent of figuring out how do we identify what community assets are available for our participants when they're sort of engaged in SCIP, whether that is, again, job training aspects or if there's a need for help through housing issues. But understanding all the assets that are available in a community, I think, are really important. So this community needs assessment did a good job, I think, at identifying that. It also looked at crime data to give us a better understanding of the kinds of crime that's happening in these 3 zip codes. But we also, which I think may have been the most rich data, if you will, was engaging in a number of focus groups where we brought in stakeholders and community members from across the 3 zip codes just to get an understanding of how SCIP can be helpful. How can SCIP be a transformative asset and an additional asset to those we've already identified to help in all the things that community members are trying to tackle. And so I think in going through this process of meeting with community members and getting an understanding that, again, we often have this sort of perspective that communities that are of much like the ones that we've identified here, that that there's no sense of pride, that there's no sense of hard work, and that there's something to contribute. And it was great in this space to hear it from community members say, look, we are proud of where we live. We know that we have some things to work with, but we want to do that to the best of our ability, and in linking up with programs like SKIP. And so getting that information through these focus groups, I think, was very helpful, because it allowed us to direct the program and the experience in different ways, and to make those community connections in the most effective manner. And so I think that certainly we learned a lot, during my 2 years with SKIP, not only from the participants, but certainly on the data side as well. But one thing I will certainly close with before I hand it over to Elizabeth here is that I think that if and when engaging in something like this, I think if we can, as I mentioned earlier, place an emphasis on humanization of our participants, I think it goes a long way in linking this idea of purpose and transformation to do what it needs to do. So I know that SKIP has undergone some transformation and has linked up with Lone Star Justice, and so I'm looking forward to hearing Elizabeth sort of talk about SKIP and its evolution and where it's gone in the past few years. So.
Great, thank you, Dr. Terry. I am going to quickly just take over driving this. Let's see, did that work, Dr. Terry? You can give me a thumbs up this time. Okay, so I'm going to assume it's working. So first, I want to just start with just a quick disclosure, right? So this entire presentation is about building legitimacy and community justice and transformational change. And you're going to hear me talk about the evolution of SKIP and some of the things that we've done to enhance what SKIP was already doing. I want to acknowledge sort of some optics here, and let's just say them out loud. So one, this is almost exclusively, SKIP was founded by people of color who live in the community of Dallas, who themselves reflected the communities from which we now work. I am not that person. I do not look like that person. And I want to make clear that when I talk about what's evolved, that it wasn't me who evolved it, but in fact was continued to be the team that started this. So what really happened is that Elise Reeves Waters, who was the city prosecutor who had been foundational in bringing this, came over and said to LSJA, we need a home for SKIP. And I have skill sets and learning and valuable insights to bring to the work that you're doing. Why don't we merge? So I want to just acknowledge that that's the true story of SKIP, is that the individuals who started SKIP continued to evolve SKIP. So when I talk about LSJA evolving, that is because LSJA merged with those foundational leaders to make sure that this transformative justice model that I described grew organically out of SKIP. And then it wasn't just something that I brought, because I think that would be really disingenuous to the people that started SKIP, that own SKIP at its core. Just Elise presented right before me, and you just didn't get the chance to have her twice. So, you're getting the poor version of the founder of this team. So I just want to really disclose those optics, because I think that's really important. That's from its core into today. This is a very transformational program that started with people of color responding to people that looked like them and making sure that racial equity was at the forefront of everything that we do. So as the Center for Core Innovation's time started to wrap up, and after the needs assessment, was about the same time that the Lone Star Justice Alliance was launching and looking for community partners to really bring some evidence-based practices to a young adult court. And it was CCI that actually introduced Elise and I and said, I think that the community needs assessment revealed really some critical extra steps that needed to take. And I think that together your partnership could bring those together. And so Elise and I sat down with Melita Strong. You've heard Dr. Terry mention her several times. And with Paul Blocker and Lynn Richardson and Judge Huff. And over the course of the next 6 to 8 months, we developed, along with experts from around the country, including the folks at Columbia's Justice Lab, many of you will probably know Vinny and Lael, from guidance by Danielle Sered and Tony Fabello. We all sort of put our minds together into what a really good next evolution of justice would be. And so we took the best of Skip and then put it on steroids. So this is what we came up with. One is a model that really looked at triggering people into a program or placing someone into a program within a triggering event. So one of the things that came out of the evolution of Skip was that people were getting assigned to the program potentially 8 months after their arrest. So they've been arrested, they return to their community, they're back with those folks that they were back with. And all of the stakeholders said, we really need to get folks earlier into the program. So now we try to get people within 24 hours of arrest so that's the triggering event. Critically, the other thing was we wanted to ask ourselves the question, Skip was working great. It was working on a small scale. Could Skip work as a true alternative to the existing system? Could racial injustice equity lead the transformation of our system, not just lives? And so from that, we thought, well, what if we just randomly assigned people into the program and then we measured whether the program could just work for anyone in these zip codes, right? Rather than those who we selectively picked. So it's now random assignment. We continued the individualized, the humanitarian, as Dr. Terry referred to it, treatment decision-making. And then we enhanced those who guided that decision-making. So we added to the team other behavioral health and social service experts. So we almost tripled the organizations, the community-based organizations that were involved in the program. We added psychologists to a multidisciplinary team so that they could inform decision-making. And then we added a guided results of a validated risk needs responsivity tool. There have been a lot of discussions, I'm sure, here today about the racial implications of such tools. We focused less on the risk aspects of the tools and more on the needs aspects of the tools. So what are the needs the tools were indicating and how could we meet those needs? Because again, while we want to address strengths, that was critically important to us. But the third thing is that we continued that intensive relationship-driven case management. So Dr. Terry talked about Melita Strong being the backbone, the fabric. So that was continued. And then we started to enhance that with justice-involved returning citizens. So we wanted to connect people with those who had been there. And this was really about getting people to really identify what strengths, what things that motivated them that could guide the transformational change. Too often we ask, what are their needs? What are their deficits? What are individuals who come before us deficits and how can we quote unquote fix those deficits? We really shifted that narrative to focus less on individuals' deficits and more on how can we strengthen the things that are working in their lives. Because I promise you that every single person who has ever walked into Skip had some really good things that were happening in their lives. And we started to focus more on how can we strengthen those good things rather than trying to fix people, rather than looking at them from a deficit-based focus. So this flip was a different tool to the toolbox that the Skip team needed. I'll tell you, this is my next thing that we did that is by far my favorite. And I think at the heart of this program, which is about really shifting the narrative around what community means in programs like this. So we don't have community service really. So we abandon community service. You know why? Because community service sounds punitive. And suddenly you stick an individual's future as service to the community as a punitive thing. But what if the narrative shifts? What if instead of something being punitive, it's an incentive, it's a positive in the life to engage in your community through an elective and maybe even through a capstone project? So these are young adults of college age. And instead of doing community service, picking up trash by the road, they develop capstone projects. They write a proposal, they develop a budget, they do a presentation to the multidisciplinary team. They get funding to go out and give to their community, to deepen their own bonds into the community. Skip had always focused and continues to focus on developing strong bones because our participants that go through this program become leaders in social justice activism, in the call for racial equity, in the call for fair housing. These Skip participants are equipped and ready to lend their voices to movements. And now, instead of community service, they're doing these capstone projects to give value to their community. And then finally, along with what Dr. Terry said, is Skip has always been focused on data and accountability. So one of the things that we did was really double down to enhance to measure our progress and measure our outcomes. So we started to create performance feedback loops. So we were constantly checking in on performance feedback and identifying if there were challenges within our own program that were impeding growth. One of the things that we did, and I'm happy to say we just launched a new case management system that is really focused on a public health lens rather than a justice lens. And so it reprioritizes data collection around social determinants of health. And we measure progress of how people's individual lives are proceeding and whether they're accomplishing their own goals with their values front and center. So again, we're not looking at their deficits and seeing if their deficits drop. Instead, we're looking at their strengths, their own well-being, their own connection to community, and whether or not they're accomplishing their goals and their values. And that becomes the measure by which we deem ourselves to be successful. And therefore, we hold ourselves accountable to the participants' needs, dreams, and wants. Finally, we loved so much of what was happening in this program that we thought, you know what? This could be a scalable model, a scalable alternative. And so we've launched, we'll hopefully soon launch, COVID got a little bit in our way, the randomized control trial. So I wanna just reset where we normally are. So current diversion programs, people apply through an application and they're screened for, quote, amenability to change. And then they go into this treatment. And the remainder and vast majority of people continue into the traditional criminal justice system. Under this model and with this research, individuals are assigned to the program from jail, and then they have the opportunity to opt in 1 out of 2. Well, everyone who comes into the program who's eligible opts into the study if they'd like to. And then 1 out of 2 will be assigned to services so that we can truly measure based upon a control group and those who receive services, whether this program affects transformational change. It's the studies being conducted by Harvard's Access to Justice Lab, Texas A&M, and UT School of Public Health. And the goal is to measure whether ultimately the program reduces recidivism, but importantly also improves social determinants of health and is cost effective, because in Texas, cost matters. And if we can improve health and social outcomes, reduce recidivism at a fraction of the cost, I hope that we're going to see transformational change in our community. And I truly believe that that's where we're on the path to. And this is what can happen when we invest in communities to be the solutions to the problems that face our young adults. And so with that, I think we can move to questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Dr. Terry. So one of the things that have come through on the chat or the Q&A is we wanted to hear a little bit more about how do you think this translates to a national landscape. Some might say that this is, specific and unique to Dallas and not representative of issues seen nationally.
Again, I think that there are some things that we're seeing, even just in 2020, that are great examples of what's happening in Dallas is not only specific to Dallas. I think that we've seen sort of this greater call for inequities to be addressed, and so while so for example, the median income in 75210 back in 2016 was $22,000 for a family of four. Now, I'm sure that we can look at other communities across the country and say that those kinds of statistics, and again, Dallas is not unique in that way, where sort of historical segregation or marginalization of certain groups leads to those kinds of realities of today. And so while the context of Dallas and those three zip codes may be unique and have their unique circumstances, I think that every community is starting to uncover how his history has mattered and how history has placed many of the sort of realities that we're facing today to the forefront. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, slavery, the legacy of that still remains here of how communities are impacted. And so while it may be different in Charlottesville from what happens in Dallas, there are still those elements that every community, I think, has to uncover on their own, and to see how those, those historical markers and things that have happened over time are impacting those communities that aren't getting the access that they need, or where we see these place-based and place-based and community-based disparities. They have a derivation from something, and we've just got to sift through those within your own unique context to figure out how to address them. So I don't think this is something unique to Dallas, and I think we're finding out more and more about that because we're seeing a tipping point where people are saying, that's enough.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. This next question is directed towards Elizabeth. You talked about, having a strength-based approach. How do you begin working from an asset-based approach? Where do people start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And let me start by saying we don't have all the answers. We're figuring a lot of this out. So this is a case study as we're working. So let me tell you my best guess, and then let's all agree to come back in 5 years, and we'll just share stories. Here's where I've got so far. First, I think is really talking to your stakeholders about what needs to happen and what evidence shows. So we took all of our stakeholders to New York, to the Columbia Justice Lab, had an emerging adult justice retreat, essentially, of communities of practice. And we brought our stakeholders there, and we really demonstrated what asset-based work looked like. And I think it really felt organic to the way that the community that we were working in Dallas and the stakeholders we were working in Dallas already thought, right? Again, our program started with community members, right? Black and brown people who lived in the community. We didn't need to teach them that Black and brown communities have strengths and assets. Right? I think it's only when you come from when your stakeholders don't look like the people who you're serving that you have to overcome some of those barriers. And because we started in a place where everyone looked like the people we were serving, there was already this knowledge of it. So one is, I think, starting with people who look like the people who you're serving and who care about the people that you're serving, and then giving tools and research and evidence as to how that works. And it was kind of a constant evolution. We ended up choosing to go with the positive behavior interventions and supports methodology. So we really used a PBIS framework. Amy Lopez, who many of you may know because she is in DC and runs the Young Men Emerging program, was incredibly kind. She found out about what we were doing at Skip, and she called and she said, look, I've been doing this positive behavioral interventions and supports, and it's working. Can we do that with y'all? And so we took a very incentive-based approach to programming. And I think it only took about 3 weeks of doing it before our case manager came back and said, oh my gosh, this works. This really works to have this additional tool in my toolbox. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much for sharing. Another question about tools that you're using. You mentioned the public health screens that you're using. Can you talk a little bit more about that for case management?
Sure. So this is where the field honestly needs to catch up with the research, but so we are utilizing right now the PACT assessment, which is actually an assessment that is utilized. It's a Texas version of the Aussie that is utilized for youth. We decided that because this was a young adult population of 17 to 24, after analyzing all of the assessments on the market, that we would use this assessment that had been really utilized for youth, because our population more similarly reflected youth needs, risks, and values. I have to tell you, it's not perfect. And overall, I think there's a need in our community to really invest in really needs-based assessment that can learn and grow like public health assessments. And as long as you and my, how many 300 people who are watching this don't tell anybody, we're working actually with the University of Texas School of Public Health to start beginning that. So we've just completed a needs survey and an index of needs with young adults to start the process of developing a needs and evidence-based strength focused assessment piece that will hopefully go through. And then once the PACT assessment, it actually triggers the need for future public health and other assessments. So personality assessments and other mental health assessments that might come after that.
It's very exciting to see what's underway. And I think we're all in the same boat in knowing that there are a lot of things that still need to be figured out. And, you're amongst a community of folks who are interested in seeding change. Dr. Terry, could you just talk a little bit more about how, your understanding of the needs assessment and, looking at disparities, what does that look like in terms of ongoing education and training? And I'd actually ask Elizabeth also to weigh in on this. What kind of things do you look towards in terms of training opportunities, additional education?
So I think there were a couple of things in the needs assessment that were important for us to look at. One is sort of educational attainment for sure, and even within the not only across the zip codes that that the program operates in, but at the individual level when the participants came in. As I mentioned sort of in the brief part of my presentation, many of the participants hadn't even finished high school. So I think in some ways you can see that as a greater reflection of what's happening in the community. And so I think at least in the individual level, part of it was just trying to figure out what is it that an individual participant has aspirations to do. What have they been good at? What kinds of things have they liked to do? For many of the participants, it was, I would like to take a community college course on how I can work in a recording studio, or I would like to figure out how I can be a phlebotomist, right? And so a lot of those things come at the sort of individual engagement level. But then again, in our needs assessment, I think our focus groups were really helpful as well, because those are where the sort of the eyes and ears to the street are. And I think that that's the kind of qualitative data that you need that really matters. And hearing from community members, what kind of programming would you like to see? Would you like community members to be more aware of and connected to? So in creating and understanding the assets that you have around you in the asset mapping that even that we did is how do we connect someone from our community to a culinary program? How do we connect them to any various sort of technical trades that might be available? And so hearing those thoughts and desires and perceptions of what might be valuable in the community, I think was important for us to not only hear, but to catalog and to categorize. And then from that point, once you have that data sort of handy now making those connections to the institutions and the other resources that can help bring those things to bear. So I think if nothing else, the community needs assessment, certainly it put data to action, and it gives you a nice foundation of figuring out where do we go next, and not just sort of randomize your thoughts on what, again, the community might need, but figuring out more so what would they like to see. And that can be any number of things. But again, it's making those connections from the data, whether quantitative or qualitative, to figure out where the needs are, and then making the connections to the resources and institutions that can bring it to bear. So I really find it as a nice foundational tool. And I think that we found that, and I think probably Lone Star and the rest of the SCIP team have found that as well, moving forward. So.
Yeah, and I think including community and making sure that they're a part of your outcomes is really important. And then it has some really concrete deliverables in the way that you do a day-to-day. So, I mentioned that we use the PACT, and I didn't actually say what that was, which is it's the Positive Achievement Change Tool. So the Positive Achievement Change Tool. But let me tell you about some of the things that concern me about that assessment tool, and we just have to be really realistic about it. So one is some quote unquote risks often are risks that have really strong derivatives in historical bias and racism that exists in our country. And when you have community that is able to reflect on some things that are deemed risk, but maybe are prevalent in community because of redlining, right? So not being a homeowner and not having a stability of home, right? That's a risk that comes out in the PACT tool. It also is a direct product of redlining that systematically made it harder for people of color to own homes and to be homeowners in South Dallas, right? So Dr. Terry showed you that really concrete map, right? Well, home ownership in the South Dallas area is incredibly low because of decades of redlining, and that has created instability in home ownership and in address allocation. And then that shows up as a risk in your risk assessment. And we as stakeholders have to be real careful whenever we're utilizing a tool that we aren't relying on a tool, right? So they are only as good as our own analytical assessments and understanding about local functions. And so to me, that's a really concrete example that whenever I see something that says risk because of transience or lack of home ownership, that I ask and our team asks ourselves the critical question of, is that a risk that is unique to the participant that we're trying to serve? Or is that a risk that requires a systemic solution to redlining and systemic injustice in our community? And our communities can help us understand what those are, right? So we don't need academics to say that. I can promise you that your community members know the answers to those questions too.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think we're close to finishing up. So I have one final question. I'm going to frame it this way that it came in. You stress a lot about, from the onset, people who are leading the charge being most impacted and disenfranchised communities, and they're leading out of passion and commitment, and they're really motivated to see change. And how do you work with or motivate people who feel removed from these realities to make equity across justice and health sectors? I think, I'd love to hear from both of you about, how do you motivate others? We saw the model of SCIP has, stakeholders from, multi-sectors, and this collaboration in this model has been, working for the last couple of years. What would you say to that?
I think a lot of it is about how do you show some evidence that hope exists, and that that hope is a possibility. I remember, and this had to be in one of the local elections that was taking place probably in 2017 or 2018, where a group of participants went with Melita Strong to go vote for the first time in their lives. And for many reasons, they had no, motivation prior to that to vote. And a lot of them, I think, in some of the feedback was like, well, we know it doesn't matter. And for them in that space, it's, well, why would I vote? Look what's happening around me. So does it matter at all? And so I think even going through that process with her that day allowed them to feel empowered, and that there are positive things that are possible. Hope is possible. And so I think in an instance like this, in a program like this, part of the job is to just show that, change isn't going to just come and sweep away the sort of the previous standing overnight, but that there are incremental things that can happen. And sometimes, again, it is at the individual level. How do you show one individual that there is hope, and that to be engaged and to participate, that it matters, and why it matters, to show those even just incremental changes and benefits. So you're not going to change people's mind overnight, but if you can, through especially something like this, show some level of positivity and growth, and again, hope, I think that's where a lot of the seeds get planted for making people to be more engaged and open to the idea that that change is possible.
Dr. Terry, you'll be thrilled to know that 100% of people who are eligible to vote and skip this election did vote. We had one 17-year-old that didn't vote. Obviously.
There you go. See?
So 100% voted, which is super exciting. So I'm going to share real personal to my, closest 200 friends that, I grew up with a corrections officer as a father. My husband is a federal prosecutor, right? So talking about mobilizing people who come from within the system to care about racial equity and South Dallas residents, or people who live in my mostly white suburban community to care about this issue is sort of like my job. And so I'll give you my best case, which is that I truly believe that people are good. And I believe if given the opportunity and education and awareness and data to understand, that people will act with goodness. And we give grace to those. It's actually a hallmark in one of our values at LSJA. Elise and I spent hours developing what our values would be. And we decided that we would really focus on four values. So we're client-centered above else. 2, we are truth tellers. So we talk very frankly, openly, and honestly about what exists in our communities, about historical incidents of racism and how it shows up as systemic injustices. But coupled, whenever you are a truth teller, is to give grace to those who work within systems, because my entire family, 7 generations, has worked within the justice system. And these are people that believe in the goodness of their communities, but are framed by the history that has confined them in systems that don't work for everyone. And so by working and giving grace to those, my own family included, and giving a path and tools to create change, I truly believe that people will move forward. And I think we've seen that. I cannot tell you the transformational change that I've seen in my lifetime, from a little kid growing up in Huntsville, Texas, where the inmates were white and were referred to by names that we will not repeat here, to now looking at diversion programs and the shuttering of prisons across Texas, that we are in a moment of transformational change. And so giving grace and giving people the option to move forward. And then lastly, our 4th value, I think, guides us too, and I think it should guide everyone on this call, which is to act with a fierce urgency of now. Because every day that those of us who are on this call don't make systemic change, every day that we make modest and incremental changes that don't incorporate the needs of directly impacted people in the communities with which we serve, we have lost out on an opportunity to give hope and opportunity not only to the people who we serve, but to our communities who need this legacy put behind us and who need to see the horizon come today. And so I encourage everybody to take this moment and reassess, can you do more? Can we do it faster? And can we do it better? And if anybody wants to join me in this fight, we are always available. You'll have my contact information, and please feedback as what you find, because I want to learn from every single person on this call. Please reach out and give me tips. I want to just encourage everybody, please call me, because we don't get it right about half the time. But I look forward to having partners who do work to get it to move forward with fierce urgency.
I'd like to thank Dr. Terry and Elizabeth so much for being the end note of a lovely day with all of you virtually. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and we're really excited to continue to see what the future holds in terms of transformational change. So with that said, I'd like to say thank you so much. I'm going to hand over the mic to our Director of Training and Technical Assistance, our National Director of National Training and Technical Assistance, Aaron Arnold, to provide some closing remarks. But before I hand it off to Aaron, I just want to say a special thank you to all of the folks who have been behind the scenes managing our conference today. We could not have done this conference without all of their hard work and their dedication over the last couple of weeks. So I just want to extend my thank you to everyone.
Well, my thank yous start with Medina Henry, who you just heard from. We, Medina, myself, Julius Lang, who you know, who retired just a couple of months ago. We're looking forward so much to having all of you join us here in New York City in person this year for this year's conference. And we're so disappointed when we couldn't make it happen. But, you know, this year has been one of change and adjustment. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about here in my closing remarks. But before I do that, just because I don't want to forget the thank yous, of course, we need to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for the unbelievable support that they've given to this field, as well as to us at the Center for Court Innovation for well over a decade. To build, enhance, evaluate community courts and to move this field forward. We thank BJA for making this event possible. To every one of our speakers and moderators, the feedback that we've gotten, you know, here and there that's reached us through text messages and stuff has been overwhelmingly positive, and we have our speakers and moderators to thank for that. And for the Center for Court Innovation staff, there's literally I would mention every single person, but I counted them up. There's over 20 there's 20 who've been deeply involved in this planning for weeks, and there's even more than that who've lent a hand along the way. It's behind the scenes, it's been a little chaotic. We think it's been mostly invisible to all of you as attendees, but it's just been a real team effort to bring this thing to fruition. And Medina and her entire staff and our folks in communications and our folks in technology who've helped us navigate this just deserve all the credit. So thank you all. Now, in terms of final thoughts, there's so much I could leave you with, but I want to let you go and enjoy your Friday evening. I just want to say on the theme of change, you know, this year, as I said, has been one of change and adaptation and unexpected challenges. You know, community courts, in a way, have been at the leading edge of change since 1993, when the Midtown Community Court was opened. We, among courts, were the first to return courtrooms to neighborhoods after years of consolidating courts into large downtown-based metropolitan courthouses. You know, Midtown was the first one who said, let's bring justice back into the community in a physical way. Put the courthouse back in the community. And we were one of the first in the community courts field. We were the first to really embrace concepts of procedural justice, which many of our speakers have talked about today. Judge Calabrese, with that memorable line when he was just getting started with interacting with the community, and someone said, "Are you really a judge?" That's about procedural justice. That's why that person's mind was blown, because Judge Calabrese wasn't acting the way a judge was supposed to act. It was treating people with dignity and respect was a real groundbreaker that the community courts had a large hand in promoting. You know, I mentioned during my previous session that, you know, I was partially involved with many of my colleagues in launching the Red Hook Peacemaking Program at the Red Hook Community Justice Center, the first restorative justice program within a courthouse, at least in New York, and we think nationally. And we were at the forefront of bringing restorative justice into the court system. Community courts did that. You know, today we've got courts in libraries, we've got courts in community centers, we've got courts in neighborhood-based courthouses, we've got community courts in centralized courthouses. You know, we've been at the leading edge of bringing justice where it needs to be in different communities. And so I want to congratulate us as a field for being at the leading edge of so many different movements and different practices and different approaches. But more importantly, I want to leave us with a challenge, because this year, among the many, many things it's taught us, is it's revealed, I think, for many of us who've worked in this field for a long time, that there is a lot of work left to do. We've lost many people of color, to police shootings and abuses. We've heard more personal stories about the damage that mass incarceration can do, the harm, in essence, that the system continues to perpetuate on those that it's supposed to be keeping safe and helping. And so I want to, again, stressing this theme of change, I want to challenge ourselves, challenge all of you, challenge my colleagues at the Center for Court Innovation to see what more we can do. What is the next leading edge of change that we can take up and be leaders for? And we need to challenge our partners as well, not just ourselves who work in the courts, but challenge our partners who work in the treatment field, challenge our partners who work as prosecutors and defense attorneys, challenge our partners who work in housing and education, to really figure out how we can address the problems that people are coming to us to solve. There were a few things that our speakers highlighted today, and they were themes that were woven throughout, starting at the very beginning with Khalil Cumberbatch this morning. We need to humanize the system. We need to double down on procedural justice, but also to, as Khalil was saying, to empower those who are closest to the problems. You know, we have community in our name. We're community courts, and we've done more than any other courts to engage the community, but we're just scratching the surface. You know, giving true power to people in the community to define what the priorities are, to co-create the change with the system. That's the kind of work that we can do more in. So we need to do that. We need to talk about harm reduction, as Elizabeth was talking about, and Tyler and Gavin and others. We need to talk about how to help individuals reduce the harm that they're feeling in their own lives, and to reduce the harm that we're doing systemically. We need to take a hard look, a square look at the racial injustices that continue to perpetuate across our systems. We need to use data to know where those injustices are manifesting. We need to hear from affected people to know how those those injustices are manifesting. And we need to start talking about meaningful new approaches that we in the community courts can model and pass on to the mainstream court system. So that's what I want to leave you with, is we've been at the leading edge of change. We have an enormous amount to be proud of. And we have the opportunity to do more. So let's take up that mantle. Let's challenge ourselves in the years to come. In 2 years, we'll come together again for another one of these conferences, and we can talk about all the additional progress we've made in the next 2 years. So again, to all of our sponsors, speakers, moderators, CCI staff, and all of you who took time out to attend and share with us, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, it's been a privilege, and we'll see you in 2 years. Thanks.